Steve Jobs once said, "Innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity rather than a threat." In today's context, we will be looking at Citibank and how in an ever-changing banking industry, it can identify the right opportunities to fuel growth and the customer journey. Hi, my name is Dinah, and I'm here today with Alice, Evan, and Bonnie, and we're excited to be presenting our recommendations for Citibank. In analyzing the landscape, we identified three key issues. The first is that although Citibank recognizes the value of data-driven technologies and data analytics, it is currently limited. Hong Kong consumers bank with multiple institutions, and so we don't have a 360-degree view of their activity. The second issue is that with the rise of fintech startups, they are able to compete and are more agile and bring to market innovations a lot quicker than Citibank. How can we forge the right strategic partnerships to continue our innovation process? The third issue is in the time of all of this digitalization, consumers are very concerned about their data privacy and transparency. How can we help them transition into this stage so that we maintain our net promoter score as a bank? Our three recommendations will address these three issues. Our first recommendation is to create a blockchain-powered identity sharing network, which will essentially pool the data across banks through a blockchain technology and give us a 360-degree view of our customers in a safe and secure way. The second recommendation is to use open APIs to stimulate fintech innovation and to enter the right ecosystems so that we can have touch points with our customers every single day outside of just typical banking transactions. And finally, we want to educate our consumers about data analytics so that they are bought into this digitalization process and happy with their experience with Citibank. I will now pass it off to Alice to speak to our first recommendation.
Thanks, Dana. Citibank is currently operating in a sea of ever-expanding data. Each day, 2.5 quintillion bytes of information are generated, and this figure is only set to increase moving forward. The important takeaway here is that it's important for Citi to identify and invest in these opportunities by listening to the data and what it's telling it in order to further its footprint in the banking space. The key insight here is that the majority of banking clients in Hong Kong have multiple accounts with multiple different banking institutions. This means that no single banking institution has the full picture of what a customer's preferences and their activities. This is an issue because this also applies to Citi, and it means that Citi is not able to have a 360-degree view of what our customers want. How do we fix this issue? We'd like to propose a blockchain-powered identity sharing network. This will allow Citi and all of its competitors to upload their customer data onto the blockchain. The blockchain will be responsible for securing, encrypting, and analyzing this data, and most importantly, matching up customer records. Then the blockchain will share these analyses back to Citi in a secure way. The key benefit to Citi here is that it will be able to leverage not only its own data, but also the data of its competitors, thus having a 360-degree view of what their customer preferences are. The key partner we'll have to leverage here is CICC, and there are three main advantages to engaging CICC. First, CICC is a company with reputable technologists. Its technology has had demonstrated efficacy and efficiencies, but most importantly, CICC has managed to solve a customer's right to be forgotten. This means that customers can select specific identifying attributes that they can erase from the blockchain and have completely scrubbed, which means that the control of a customer's data lies 100% in the customer's hands. So now that we have all of this data, what are we going to do with it? I'd like to present two key case studies. First, in Canada, all 6 of the major Canadian banks have invested in this blockchain-powered technology, partnering with CICC and Hyperledger. Similarly, in Japan, 3 of their top banks have also invested in identifying the feasibility of this technology. The key takeaway here is that this implementation indicates that the network is technically competent and feasible, but most importantly, has regulatory compliance worldwide. So now that we have all of this,
So a question for you.
Yeah.
So when every bank is contributing, your case study previous page, every bank is contributing to this hyperledger. That means we're at a playing level field with other banks. So what kind of competitive advantage the city has by participating?
exactly. It'll be important in a data field that is leveled by shared data access to really focus in on the type of insights we can gain from this data. Specifically, there are two key categories of data analysis techniques we can use: descriptive analytics and prescriptive analytics. By combining these two types of analytic procedures with Citibank's key business activities of marketing, anti-money laundering, and portfolio optimization, we're able to have a matrix-style framework that we can use to organize our analysis and make sure that we fully capture all of the potential benefits of this shared data platform.
And have you ever think of, if you're HSBC, which dominates the market by 70% of the market share of a single, current and savings account, why do you think that he or HSBC is willing to participate? And if he is not participating, what's the benefit for me to get a 100-degree instead of a 360-degree view of the customer?
Absolutely. So the key part of having buy-in for our competitors is to ensure that we have a critical mass of data on our shared database. We plan to capture this by first approaching one of our smaller competitors and encouraging them to participate in this network with us. This way, we'll be able to achieve a minimum critical mass, and even as large as a competitor as HSBC will be able to wonder what they're missing out on. Ultimately, this will create an opportunity that competitors such as HSBC cannot afford to miss. This is also illustrated in some of our case studies. So for example, in Canada, all 6 of the biggest banks have participated. Even though they have different degrees of market share and different degrees of penetration in the banking space, they all recognize that by participating in this network, there are mutual benefits, and this is an opportunity that they fundamentally can't afford to miss.
And what exact data that they are supplying to this hyperledger?
The type of data that they'll be supplying to this shared identity network will be dependent on what we determine as compliant with the rules and regulations in Hong Kong. Currently, there's not a lot of regulation and in this space, which means that we'll have to work closely with regulators to ensure that the information we're sharing is okay with customers. And that said, the customers themselves will have the right to be forgotten as we're able to leverage SecureKey's capabilities in this space. This means that even after we decide on the metrics that the customers will be sharing, the customers themselves can choose not to participate. So they can select the identification attributes that they don't want to be included and shared with other banks and have that completely scrubbed from the blockchain. And so this means that ultimately, at the end of the day, no matter what we decide as a bank, the control of an individual customer's data will rest 100% in their own hands. So ultimately, in a leveled playing field caused with sharing a shared data space, it'll be important for Citibank to generate actionable and refined insights from the big data in order to sustain Citi's competitive advantage. I'll now pass it off to Evan, who will walk us through the benefits of allowing open access to our APIs.
Thanks, Alice. The next element of this recommendation will talk about how Citibank can increase the pace of innovation given its core competencies. The market landscape for Citibank is ever-changing, as our competitors are no longer big banks, but they are rising and emerging fintech companies. This is seen in 2016, when $19 billion were invested into the space. And furthermore, Citibank's own estimates suggest that by 2023, 17% of all consumer banking services will be done by fintech. We see this as an opportunity. Fintech companies have strong growth potential in specific areas like payment processing and consumer banking, which represents 62% of all of Citibank's current revenues. So the question then becomes, what should our strategy be towards fintech? And to analyze this, we looked at some case studies. First, we looked at Bank of America, which took an internally building model. They invested $3 billion into an innovation budget. However, Because Citibank's expected product implementation plan is 6 to 9 months, which is far longer than the average fintech company, we do not think it's feasible for us to take an internal strategy to bring products to market. We then looked at JP Morgan, which took an external building model by creating 2 large partnerships with fintech companies. However, given that 70% of startups tend to fail, and it's very difficult for us to actually track future trends, we think it is better for us to diversify our risk by having multiple partnerships. Citibank has legacy infrastructure, which means that we're not poised to necessarily find out what the next big trends are, but we are poised to deal with compliance and regulatory issues. And to that end, we believe that Citibank should leverage infrastructure as a service and foster a digital ecosystem. But what does a digital ecosystem look like to Citibank? Well, as one of the 5 biggest banks in Hong Kong, Citibank has access to millions of data points from our clients. Conversely, third-party developers have great and innovative ideas, but their lack of data acts as a barrier to growth. We see this as a synergistic opportunity where we have the infrastructure and they have the agility. However, when we went onto the developer website for Citibank, we observed that their current API access is in closed beta. This means that it is increasingly harder for third-party developers, individuals like myself, Alice, or any of you, to gain access to our API. This barrier to entry ultimately results in the prevention of third-party developers from getting immediate access to our data. And this results in a potential for a lack of interest and the loss of thousands of partners that we could have attained. Because of the fast-paced nature of this industry, we need to provide immediate access to our API. And an open API system would provide this participation and innovation by providing this immediate access to our data. But what do we actually recommend? We recommend that we create a digital ecosystem through open APIs in a 3-pronged process. First, we open APIs for developers. Looking at our data competencies, we've identified multiple use cases that third-party developers can integrate into their business model. Second, we want to monetize the data to create economic value for Citibank. We'll do this by modeling after Google Maps, a very popular API, and adopt a 3-tiered pricing strategy. First, providing free access to our data to get people on board, and then incrementally charging them based off use. We'll leverage this insights and these information to help us foster a strategy as to which companies we should then bring into our next element, which is shifting from a build internally strategy to a build by partner strategy. But how will this look like? First, by opening access to our API, we'll allow companies to leverage our data for rapid growth. We'll follow these companies to get to the second element, observing these startups and then deciding which are the most feasible and high potential and acquiring those. And finally, we'll then integrate the ones that we decide to acquire into Citi FinTech to then grow and build internally once we already know the companies have good growth potential and also will align with our business plan.
Is there any risk, that we are running in terms of, this openness, quote unquote, of our data as well as of our, portal, and attract cybersecurity issues?
So I think that the key significance that Citibank has over our competitors is that we do have this legacy infrastructure that allows us to compete with a more secure platform than any other bank. And that exact point is the differentiator that will make sure that we are the most secure and is a reason why other third-party developers will choose our API over another competitor. And so we think it's actually a value for us.
I like charging, the day for the data, but will that attract also negative publicity? If our customer know that we are charging our vendors and our communities by data.
So we think that by providing free access up into 5,000 pings per day is actually going to be a benefit for publicity because it shows that we're fostering a hub and a culture of innovation among developers who may not have the financial resources yet to foster their own growth. The key significance is that the cost that is incurred by these companies directly results in the demand that they're receiving themselves. So at the point where they're charging more, they also are receiving more pings, which means that they're getting revenue as well. So for any companies that actually doesn't have the financial resources to get on board, they can still use the free access. And at that point, when they do have enough pings, then the more use they get, the less expensive it becomes as it becomes incrementally costly. The final element of this recommendation will deal with managing managing larger partners and relevant companies. What we want to do is we want to leverage our open access and our open API as a bargaining chip to create large partnerships with major companies and leverage their brand prominence as well, while also garnering a greater amount of ping revenue.
Can you give me one example of the open API that you have in mind?
For sure. So we think that a great example of a use case is the Activate feature, which allows third-party companies to gain the access from their clients and utilize that so individuals can do transactional information. A great example of this would be a partnership with Hustlebee. A great example of this would be a partnership with Honestbee. Honestbee is a company that is the first Hong Kong grocery demand service and has great growth potential, being that in their first round of financing, they raised $15 million US. A good example of what they could do is utilize their grocery service and their grocery apps along with our consumer data so that when individuals join their app, they get instant access to their data, and all of a sudden the transaction wait time is far less for them. So it's a much more seamless process. The benefit is that Citibank's logo will be on this app and the data will be sponsored and funded by Citibank. So we get the brand prominence, ensuring this constant ecosystem where consumers have multiple touch points with us even outside of the banking process. So ultimately,
Sorry, back to your example. So what's the need for me as a customer?
So the difference for you as a customer is that you no longer have to go through the hassle of uploading your own data, and also you don't have to go through the hassle of managing your own transactions. This was just one example, but Citibank has over 30 APIs currently existing. And the benefit is that by going through Citibank, or by having Citibank's open API, a customer will have multiple different touch points with Citibank as their base, which simplifies the entire process. 10 seconds of wait time over 10 apps. Over time, you get multiple time of waiting, reduced waiting, and this will have a benefit to all customers, and also looks beneficial for our brand as it's widely shown. So the benefits of partners will increase our brand prominence and garner revenue, which will help with economic value. Now I'll pass it off to Dinah, who's going to be discussing our change management plan.
Thanks, Evan. So the first two recommendations that we presented to you involved a lot of change for the company and particularly for the consumer. And we want to address how we're actually able to address their concerns. What we know right now is that 75% of consumers don't think that their data is safe with big companies. And across the board, what we can see here is that on average, only 20% of consumers know that their data is even being collected by these various channels. Now, why is this an issue? Let's ground ourselves in this thinking. If consumers are uncertain whether or not we're actually providing them value by collecting their data, they're going to feel discomfort, have a poor experience. And what this is going to translate to is ultimately a lowered net promoter score for the company. We understand that this is a metric that is extremely important because not only does it show the financial value, the lifetime value of a customer, but it's also a reflection of their satisfaction with the company. And therefore, we want to make sure that they're comfortable and this score remains high for Citibank. This is actually compounded for Citibank as a whole in Hong Kong because of the fact that on average, Hong Kong consumers tell 18 people about poor experiences and only 6 about positive ones. So again, this grounds us in the fact that we really need to make sure they're comfortable. So our recommendation is 3-pronged in educating customers. The first is to proactively communicate. So what we recommend is sending out a report to all of our customers that outlines what data is being collected, what it's being used for, and what are the benefits that they can actually expect to receive from sharing this data with us. Also in the report, we want to outline a lot of the safety systems and attack prevention measures that we have as a company, for example, processes through Cisco. The second thing is welcoming conversation. So something that we understand about Citibank is that it prides itself in its beautiful technology-driven branches. We got to see some of them the other day, and they're great. We think that we should actually open the doors to these branches and host quarterly DigiTalks for our customers that educate them about digitization and make them more comfortable with the process. Finally, although we can tell them what value they might get, we actually need to demonstrate that to them. And there's 2 ways that we can do that. First, we recommend keeping a web page of all the fintech startups that are actually using the APIs and creating valuable services for customers, similar to the ones that Evan outlined. We also see that the Facebook chatbot that has been rolled out in Singapore and will be moving across Asia to places like Hong Kong will provide a lot of value because there are 3 million people in Hong Kong that use this service, Messenger, and when they see Citibank ingrained in it and providing relevant analytics and information, they'll see that the data they were willing to give to us provided them value as a consumer. So ultimately, by educating them, we're able to make use of our first two recommendations that involve a lot of high change, but a lot of positive impact when our consumers understand them and fully appreciate them.
I know that you guys are still studying, but sorry to say that sometimes education is a little bit overrated. The proactive communication we did a lot. So 90% of our proactive communication got ignored by the customer because they don't feel the pain, when we talk to them on such a thing. So how are you going to register this kind of education or information, with the customer more effectively than just a plain piece of communication?
Yeah, so I think in effect that is a function of how effective the marketing is. I think there's a lot of insights that we can garner in terms of what sorts of language and communication would actually resonate with the particular, for example, affluent segments versus sort of the private clients. But I think ultimately technology adoption comes in two sort of main phases. The first thing that you can do as a company is that education piece. We can fuel understanding with the customers, help them understand and try and push out. But the reality is, as you mentioned, not everyone's going to read it. Not everyone's going to have time for that education. The second piece to technology adoption is simply that as companies continue to adopt it, the technology matures, more people become comfortable. And in a sense, that's what it's going to take. A similar technology that we can speak to is GPS, for example. So GPS initially was a very sensitive topic because it's geolocation data. This is something people weren't comfortable in sharing. But the companies pushed out communication, and over time, as more sort of adopted this technology, people became more mature, more comfortable with it, and it was the two things together that ultimately led to the adoption. And I think similarly, it will require these two things for our recommendations. So I'll now pass it off to Bonnie to speak to the financial implications for Citibank.
Sorry, one question before we go into this section. If we go back to the open API suggestions, as a matter of fact, we opened our API globally in November 2016 and in Hong Kong in March this year. I'm sure you researched that already. So what is actually new here on top of our open API strategy? Can you summarize that again?
So there are two major differences between what you're talking about and our recommendations. The first is that we recognized that during your challenge summits, you provide open access to API to all the competitors. However, upon a public individual going onto the website, it does not appear to be open, and so third-party developers are deterred in that sense. We want to make this open access public for all individuals and all developers through our website and through our portal. The second element, and the most crucial element, is monetizing our data. We want to provide an economic value towards every access that we get. And there's two benefits to monetizing our data. First, the economic value. As I walked through earlier, we have a three-tiered process. The second, and as you'll notice, is that this three-tiered process only goes up into 100,000 pings. The reason it does that is because at the point where a company is garnering over 100,000 pings, we recognize that as they're massively growing and increasing in demand. And we'll use this as a criteria to decide which companies we'll then partner with. Because if they're able to use our data to garner massive growth, we think that is clear synergistic potential. And so now we're getting the benefit of observing these companies in a strong mechanism. So those are the two major differences. So now we'll pass it off to Bonnie to talk about the financial implications of our recommendations.
Thanks, Evan and Dinah. So one question remains: what are the financial implications for Citibank? Well, when looking at how we can monetize our three strategic recommendations, we see that with our first recommendation, we can increase product sales with better data analytics and better product recommendations. With our second one, the second recommendation will enable us to really save money first on making smarter investments in innovative fintechs, as well as receiving revenues from our API. And our third recommendation will allow us to improve our NPS and ultimately extract more value from each customer, because each promoter is 2.5 times more valuable than a detractor. And so ultimately, we're able to achieve an NPV of $134 million. Yeah, did you have a question?
What assumptions did you make in determining the 3-year NPV is 133.9 million? What major assumptions?
Sure, I can show you that. Okay, just have to flip through them. Oh. Okay, lucky stuff. So for the basically there you can see for recommendation 1, I assumed for increased product sales from improved analytics, basically taking Asia revenues and then scaling it down for Hong Kong, 1 million customers out of the 16.6 Asian customers, and then assuming the first year we could get 5% increase, 7% increase, and then 9% for the third year. And then for recommendation 2, looking at API sales. So basically for API sales, based on the pricing scheme of Evan, if we assumed, because I know in 2016 we had 16 good fintech partners, and in 2017, 20. So based on that number, if we scaled up to the pricing scheme we had, these are the numbers we achieved. And for recommendation 3, we're assuming we can improve NPS by 15 points, and based on the research by Bain, each additional promoter brings $300,000 in lifetime value. And then these are also basically for the cost of a lot of hiring developers and data analytics scientists, and these are the salaries that we use to estimate that. Okay. Okay, and then so with those assumptions, we assumed we achieve a year-over-year revenue CAGR of 19% for our recommendations, and our recommendations will bring a 132% return on investment, as well as reducing the cost to serve of our customers by $67 million just over the first 3 years. We know that with any strategic recommendation, risks are definitely inherent to that, and so we've mapped out our risks based on impact and probability of occurrence. So we've already touched on a few of these risks, but I would just like to highlight, we know regulation and governance is definitely a major concern for Citibank, of course. And so we know that currently in Hong Kong, with topics such as distributed ledgers, there's not much firm regulation yet, and we know that regulators are looking to work with the bank, so we just propose being open and transparent about our processes, and also modeling after, for example, in Canada, where they've already implemented part of this, working with regulators to ensure that we can make the best policies and also extract the most benefit for Citibank. And lastly, we know Citibank operates with a 3-year outlook, and so we've modeled our implementation timeline similarly. And so basically, in conclusion, our 3 recommendations will not only help Citibank to grow, but they will bring value for our customers, bring a lot of economic value like we discussed, and they are systemically responsible. And so really, ultimately, these exciting opportunities will allow Citibank to really grow and to innovate into the future. Thank you, and we now welcome any further questions.
So I have one question, on your data sharing network. So I can understand that it's a benefit for the banks, to know more about the customer in a 360 degree. But what's in it for the customer? Why would the customer want the banks to share data among themselves?
The benefit for the customer is an improved experience. As Evan and Bonnie mentioned, having additional information about the customers, for example, within the wealth segment, it allows us to make more personalized and more refined recommendations based on the particular profiles that we can infer about our customers. For example, an example would be with a 360-degree view of what our customers prefer, we're able to generate more granular, more specific recommendations. So for example, we can infer that a customer is very risk averse, we can infer specifics about the risk tolerance, and with that in mind, we can represent some more specific products that are more tailored to that.
Thank you very much.